RPG Maker games have been a fascination of mine since my early teens. There was hardly anything I loved more during that time than to sit at my computer and watch YouTubers play through titles like Misa or Mogiko Castle. Something about the truly bizarre stories these games tell hooks me into them even today. However, despite being as invested as I was in them, it would be almost 2 or 3 years of watching Let's Plays before I ever played one for myself. When I finally did, that game was Rockwood, but that's not what this video is about. It's about the second one that I played. Angels of Death is a horror game written by Makoto Sanada and published in 2015 by Vaka Game Magazine. It's still a free download off Vaka's website, though you'll have to speak Japanese to understand the dialogue. For the majority of those watching this video, you'll have to pay $10 for the game on Steam, which is what I did. Nowadays, Angels of Death is more well known for its animated series adaptation, so much so that everyone I talked to who's seen it didn't even know it was based on a video game in the first place. On YouTube as well, there are far more people talking about that than the original work. Now, I'm not trying to say that I'm the real fan and these people are a bunch of fakers or anything like that, but I think it's weird the original product doesn't receive much attention outside of RPG Maker circles. Why is this? Was the main question on my mind when I started production of this video. As a teenager, I loved it. I legitimately thought it was one of the best games I had ever played, probably because it was exactly the type of edgy yet artsy thing I was looking for at the time, so maybe I'll end up disliking it revisiting it for this review. Only one way to find out. Typically, in my videos, I get story summary and critique out of the way immediately, but Angels of Death is almost all story, and if you play it after knowing all the major plot points and twists, then you're really missing out on a lot. So for this video, I'll talk about everything else about the game first, so you can make up your mind on whether to play it, and only after that will I touch the plot. Firstly, let's talk about the visuals. What you're seeing right now is not what I saw during my playthrough. The footage that you see right now is in the correct aspect ratio. However, when running the game in full screen mode, the image is stretched out to encompass most of the screen. I tried to find a way to change this in the settings, but no luck. So you might think, well, just play in windowed mode. Unfortunately, this causes a new problem. The window is too small and its size can't be changed. When I played Angels of Death for this review, I recorded it in full screen with OBS. I never intended to change how the footage looked, since I like to give an accurate representation of how a product appears. However, when I examined my footage at the end of each recording session, the image was no longer stretched. I set OBS to record my computer screen, so I honestly have no idea how this happened. Is it the game? OBS? My computer? If anyone has an explanation for this, I would appreciate it. As for the visuals themselves, they're alright. I've always liked the way Sanada draws characters, and these designs are no exception. Everything else visually is what I'd expect from a game of this type, but it all works well. Each location felt distinct, and they all tied into their floor masters' personalities in very interesting ways. Unfortunately, when a lot of things are happening on screen, the frame rate slows down a bit. This was the worst in this section in the dark, where I felt like I was moving through molasses. The music really helps to capture the tone of most scenes. It's all copyright free, but that doesn't make it any worse to me. When I was younger, I would often dismiss music in the public domain as stuff not worth listening to. If it's free, that's because no one wants to listen to it. Angels of Death was the first game that challenged this notion. Every single track the devs picked was perfect for the chosen scene. When some important characters are rebelling against the wishes of someone who lacks their best interest, the music is dramatic and uplifting. When a character is having a bad trip, the track is distorted and crazed. When a character is in desperate need of life-saving resources, the music turns frantic once it's discovered that they've lost access to them. Despite being made in RPG Maker, Angels of Death has no turn-based combat. When not walking to the next room to make the story progress, I was doing one of two things: solving puzzles and being chased. Most of the puzzles are pretty simple, as you just have to use the correct object in the correct situation, but I still enjoyed them. My favorite one is this gas chamber that the protagonists have to bust out of. There's plenty to figure out in this little room, and it must be solved under a time limit, adding needed tension. I also love the dialogue between the duo that adds some additional flavor. As mentioned previously, there's an abundance of chase sequences. These tests of reflex were always a nice change of pace from the usual walking around. Right before one starts, a player is always given a chance to save, which I'm torn on. On one hand, I'm glad that a failsafe exists so that no one will have to power through a ton of dialogue they've already seen. But it also ruins a lot of the tension because it basically gives me a heads up before anything scary happens, which is pretty damning for a horror game. And that's all I can say without getting into spoilers. In a game this story-focused, most of the video was always going to be about the narrative. If this looks interesting to you at this point, then feel free to pause the video and play it for yourself. For the rest of you, allow me to relay and pick apart the tale of Angels of Death.
Where am I?
Angels of Death begins with the protagonist, Rachel Gardner, waking up on floor B7 of a building. She has no memory of how she got here, but, unlike every other game I've covered on this channel, she actually remembers her life story. Last she recalls, she was being examined at a hospital after witnessing someone's death. She wants to get outside, but when she finally finds an elevator to the above floors, the PA system blares that she is a sacrifice who is being let into the play area. It also announces that subsequent floors must make preparations for her arrival. Having nowhere else to go, she boards the elevator. Unfortunately for her, it only takes her one floor up. B6 doesn't even look like the inside of a building, it's more like a crime scene. Newspaper articles litter the ground, detailing horrific stories about a serial killer who's been hacking their victims to bits. Lo and behold, she runs into the master of B6, a bandaged man with near superhuman strength who wields a scythe. Despite a couple of close calls, she's able to escape his reach and get to B5. B5 is reminiscent of a hospital. Here, Rachel encounters a familiar face. Daniel Dickens is her therapist that she saw in the aftermath of her incident. Danny explains that there are some rules to this building. Most notably that floor masters cannot leave their particular location. He comforts Ray and promises to help her get out of the building. But as they spend more time together, his behavior gets more erratic and obsessive. He constantly makes creepy remarks about how perfect Rachel's eyes are and how worried he is that she'll damage them. Eventually, he can't resist himself and straps Rachel to an examination chair. He reveals himself as the master of B5 and prepares to extract her eyes for his collection. Right before he does so, he makes a remark about how Rachel will be meeting her parents in hell. I wouldn't usually draw attention to a statement like this, as ordinarily this would just be something added in to make the scene more shocking. However, the moment Rachel hears that word, she shuts down completely. It's as if all her motivation to live vanishes immediately. Danny is so fascinated by this that he immediately frees her from the table since it makes her eyes even more amazing to him. Gross. Just then, the master of B6 enters the room and slashes Danny with his scythe. After this incident, the PA system screeches that he's violated the rules of the building, and is now a sacrifice along with Ray. He's about to take a stab at Ray, but once he sees her dull, lifeless expression, he decides it's not worth it. Rachel, shockingly, now disagrees, and asks him to end her life on the spot. This request is sickening to the serial killer, and he tells her to get away from him. When she figures out how to open the next elevator, however, she gets his interest. The killer's name is Isaac Foster, and he is not looking to die in this building. Unfortunately, he's really dumb. And at a facility like this, he'll definitely get himself killed on his own. So the two enter an agreement. If Rachel gets Zach out of the building, he'll kill her. With that settled, they head up to B4, which contains a graveyard and more. Most shocking is that there are already gravestones for the two of them. They also begin to hear a strange, childlike voice following them around, which obviously ends up being this floor's master, Edward Mason. Like Danny, he has a creepy obsession with Rachel, proclaiming his desire to kill her out of love frequently. His theme is as unsettling as his personality. He gets pretty close to convincing Rachel on this, but once Zach says he swears to God he'll kill her, Ray immediately rejects any advances by Eddie, much to his chagrin. After Zach said those exact words, she is really enthusiastic about Zach killing her. Rachel and Zach have this delightfully odd dynamic, particularly in the first two episodes. Zach tends to get annoyed with Ray a lot throughout the adventure, but whenever he does, her response is so deadpan, which only serves to frustrate him even more. I've never gotten tired of these interactions during any of my playthroughs. One of my favorite scenes is when Zach talks about a previous victim of his who claimed that she wanted him to kill her. He thought the act was cute, but he decided to end her life anyway. When he caught her, she dropped the act and begged for her life. Zach killed her painfully, as he hated her dishonesty. He brings this story up to Rachel in an attempt to freak her out, as he's come to view her as putting up a similar act to avoid death. However, Ray's like, "Oh, if I do the same, then will you kill me right now?" "Ah, wait, damn, never mind, you only gave me 3 seconds. All of a sudden, Zach's now the freaked out one, since she's proven her seriousness about being killed. These disturbing yet fun interactions are littered throughout the game, and I love them. Back to the main story. After this humiliating rejection, Eddie has pretty much lost it. He demands that Rachel turn herself over to him, but she refuses. Eddie tries to capture her by darkening the lights, but when Rachel turns the power back on, Eddie finds himself in a rather unfortunate position. Ray and Zach then open up the elevator and head to B3. He compliments Rachel for helping him out, which is the first time in a while that she seems genuinely happy. One touch that I like is how the floor masters' rooms each fit their personalities. B6 is gross and has an uncomplicated layout, which parallels Zach's unnerving personality and simple, albeit gruesome desires. B5 is clean and tidy, but when we get to revisit it a little bit later, it's become a complete mess, much like Danny's warm, comforting personality being a front for more sinister intentions. B4 is laid out simply, with every room being used for something important, as if it was designed by someone who's familiar with construction. Also, Zach's theme is excellent. You could hear a bit of it in the clip I played earlier, but it really deserves to be played in full. One of this game's best tracks, no doubt about it. Overall, the first episode is a great setup for the rest of the game. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of story stuff for me to analyze here other than don't creep on teenagers. That's a pretty good lesson.
Well, this is gonna suck.
When Rachel and Zach enter B3, they soon hear over the PA the voice of this floor's master, Catherine Ward. B3 is basically a maximum security prison. Zach and Ray even have to take their mug shots before proceeding. Kathy mocks the duo of sinners during their stay in her residence, and she has a particular fascination with Zach. She always talks with such joy about how it's her task to tame a monster like him. Her smug, happy attitude drives Zach up a wall. Her theme reflects her sense of superiority over them. To get to the next elevator, the pair have to make their way through multiple torture rooms, each one ramping up in intensity. In the first one, Zach accidentally sits in an electric chair and is shocked for a few minutes while Ray figures out how to disable the power supply. In the next, Zach and Ray are stuck in a gas chamber, which they end up finding a surprising way out of. Then they have to go through a parkour challenge that splits them up temporarily. A bit of an aside, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering why Zach doesn't know more about the Floor Masters. After all, he's implied to have been working in this building for a while now, so wouldn't he have interacted with them previously? Or at the very least, he should have a general idea of what to expect on each floor. To answer your question, hypothetical viewer, he lived in B6, so he never had to leave unless he needed supplies. He always thought the other Floor Masters were really creepy though, so he never interacted with them unless he absolutely had to. As you can guess, this has been biting him in the ass ever since he became a sacrifice. Throughout this episode, Zach has visions into his past life before entering the complex. He was raised in an orphanage that regularly abused the children under their care. He relied on scraps from the trash to live, and the managers viewed him as less than human due to his burn marks. They even tasked him with getting rid of the corpses of other children that died under their supervision. One day, Zach walked into their room to find a slasher film playing on their TV, which inspired him to start killing. Those managers ended up being his first victims. It's a fascinating story, but its impact is hurt a bit by the fact that a lot of this information was revealed in the previous episode. I would have preferred if all of Zach's backstory was divulged during this chapter, because a lot of this is just a visual confirmation of stuff we already know. Anyways, Zach reliving this memory adds on to his emotional stress a lot, as he's not fully over this part of his life. When playing through the chapter, it's hard not to notice his mind slipping more and more. These dreams hit their most extreme after Zach has to inject himself with a hallucinogenic drug. It drives him to the point where he's ready to snap and kill Rachel the second he comes into contact with her. And while she wouldn't be opposed to this, she knows that Zach would likely not make it out alive if she were to die right here. This temporarily allows Zach to snap out of his manic trance, and he tells her to stay alive. Just for now. She runs away from him, but she hits a dead end at the B3 control room. Kathy, who's also in the room, tosses Rachel the gun so she can fight back. However, Ray refuses to defend herself. She understands the game Kathy's playing. From the second Ray and Zach arrived on her floor, she's been waiting for them to turn on each other, but Ray won't let her see such a thing, as she believes that what she and Zach should do should be for their sake, not Kathy's. This brief speech seems to awaken something in Zach, who promptly slashes himself instead, much to the shock of Ray and Kathy, the latter of whom rushes past the bulletproof glass to confirm what she just saw. Now convinced that the duo were half-baked sinners, she resigns herself to riddling them with bullets instead. Realizing that Zach will be killed first, Rachel turns the gun on Kathy, who reveals it was never loaded in the first place. As she's about to empty an entire magazine into him, Rachel reaches into her handbag and pulls out her own fucking gun. Once this happens, Kathy's upbeat attitude completely falls apart. She enters a crazed state and turns all the guns in the room against Ray. But before Kathy can fire a single one of them, Zach gets up and slashes her arm off. And a few other things. After this, opening the elevator isn't a very difficult challenge. The whole floor loops around, and the elevator exit wasn't far from where they entered. Ray and Zach enter the elevator to B2, but once they arrive at their destination, Zach is unresponsive. I found this episode to be better than the previous one for a few reasons. First off, Zach and Rachel have already been established as characters, so we can spend the entire chapter seeing their hijinks rather than half of one. Second off, Kathy is a fantastic antagonist, far better than the previous ones. All of the Floor Masters are pretty crazy, but she really ramps the sadism up to 11. B3 fits her very well. The most batshit insane character deserves the most batshit insane floor after all. And although we learned a lot of this during the first episode, I love that we get to see some of Zach's past through his own eyes. Is it a very pleasant story? No, but I wanted to learn more about him, and I got that here. At the end of the episode, you know everything important about him.
Oh no. Zach? Zach!
Rachel has to drag Zach out of the elevator. His wounds are serious, and she forces him to stay at the B2 entrance until she finds a way to treat them, much to his protest. Unfortunately for her, the second she opens the door to another room, she starts tripping out as a result of the floor's incense. When she's in this drugged state, the game deep fries her character portrait. This is a very important thing that I have to point out. She eventually stumbles straight into the Floormaster's cathedral. The man who runs B2 is named Gray. He's a tall, ominous figure decked out in priest's clothing. His theme is an intense organ piece. Unlike the other Floormasters, he doesn't threaten Rachel. Instead, he wants to judge her character, and Zach's injuries have provided him with an excellent opportunity to do so. See, there's no medicine on B2, but there is some on B5, and he'll accompany Ray if she passes a couple trials of his. Before Ray accepts this offer, she checks with Zach, who reacts about as poorly as you'd expect to this news. But facts are facts. He can't do anything in his condition. Before Rachel leaves, he tells her to head to B6 and grab some stuff from his room. With that, Gray and Rachel head back down the building. Gray's tests are not that great, to be honest. Okay, so the moment Rachel boards the elevator, that same incense from B2 emanates from Gray, causing her to see some rather interesting things. Gray's goal on each floor is to find the switch that resets the entrance elevator to move downward. That sounds simple, but B3 and B4 contain some challenges on the way there. B3's switch is behind these prison bars, but once Rachel gets there, the spirits of the previous prisoners start attacking her, and she barely escapes. To neutralize the threat, she activates Kathy's security system to shoot them down. Don't ask me how you shoot a ghost, because I don't know. But once she reaches Gray, he asks her how she was able to press the switch without getting harmed by the spirits, and she's like, I shot them down because they were in my way. And sure, that's true, but I think it would be a little important to mention that they attacked you first, right? When she says it like this, any listener is going to think that she's a psychopath. And yes, that's exactly how Gray takes this, and I can't blame him. I understand Rachel is an odd manner of speaking, but to neglect to mention such a critical fact about the situation feels out of character for her. However, I actually think the game wanted me to view Rachel's actions against the ghosts in a negative light. I'll elaborate more on this once I get to the conclusion.
The test on B4 is a bit better from a narrative standpoint. The switch is in the back of Eddie's refrigerator, where Ray can't reach it. Rather than doing what any reasonable person would do, asking for help or finding something to stand on, she takes these living hands and stabs them together on a pickaxe to create a tool to push the switch from farther away. Gray is justifiably disappointed in her for this. During both tests, the spirits of Eddie and Kathy chastise Ray over her actions, accusing her of having a disregard for the lives of others. Okay, so the thing with the hands, fair enough. That's a pretty terrible thing to do. But the spirits in the prison literally kill Rachel if she stays around them. Don't tell me that was anything other than self-defense. Her actions were completely justified. Also, these are not the kind of people who should be lecturing her about any of this stuff. Once they finally make it to B5, Ray ends up getting knocked unconscious while running away from another hallucination, ending her trance. When she awakes, she discovers that all of the shelves have been robbed of their medicine. She confronts Gray about this, thinking that he must have been lying to her, but he blames her for its disappearance, which... No, the one who's actually responsible for taking it was none other than Danny, who survived his encounter with Zach in B5. Apparently, he was carrying some padding underneath his lab coat. He's rocking a pretty sinister new theme now, too. He's made his way to B2, where he taunts Zach about his injuries and offers to give him the medicine in exchange for Ray's eyes, which of course Zach declines to do. When Danny attempts to leave, Zach runs after him, but with his body in such a sorry state, he has little hope of catching up. On B6, Ray finds what Zach is looking for, a knife and some bandages, or at the very least, those are the only things of use among the cereal boxes and soda cans that litter his room. Once she returns to B2, she finds that Zach has vanished. When Gray sees this, he immediately pins the blame for Ray's misfortune on Ray herself. He presumes that Danny must have taken the medicine in an irrational fit of frustration to attract Ray's attention. To be fair to the Reverend, this is true, but it's not Rachel's fault that Danny is obsessed with her. Nevertheless, he walks off to prepare her sentencing. Eventually, Ray catches up to Zach, who's collapsed onto the floor in another area. He's relieved to see Rachel return with a knife, since a scythe is too heavy for him to use at the moment. Unfortunately, as they head further into B2, there's an incident involving some snakes that requires Zach to act fast to prevent Rachel's death. He saves her, but his injuries only worsen, forcing him to stay behind yet again while Ray does the work. Of course, she eventually runs into the Reverend again, who just met up with Danny earlier. While he's deeply disappointed in the doctor's unhinged behavior, Gray ultimately blames Danny's obsession with Rachel on Rachel, who he now suspects of having bewitched him. He also reveals that Danny is the reason why Ray is even present in the building in the first place, which Gray uses as further evidence for his accusations. Before Danny left, Gray took some of the medicine from him, but he refuses to hand it to her unless she survives his trial. The room cuts to black. and suddenly, Rachel is in a courtroom. During the trial, Gray hears testimonies from the spirits of Kathy and Eddie, who are about as biased against her as you'd expect, as well as one from Danny, who strongly praises Rachel, though this only serves to confirm Gray's feelings about her. At the end of the testimonies, Gray condemns Rachel as a witch, and orders her to be burned at the stake so that God's holy flame can sanctify her. When Rachel protests that nothing like this is written in the Bible, Gray simply states that he is the god of this place. Here, Rachel's god is nothing more than a false idol. As she's being burned alive, she finds that Zach's knife is keeping her cool. Once she realizes that the fire is no longer a threat to her, she wakes up from the illusion, declaring that her god has protected her. She holds Gray at knife point and forces her to give up the medicine. Although reviled by her actions, he has no choice but to give in to her demands. Notably, Ray decides not to kill him, since he's no longer standing in her way, which he finds rather amusing. Once Ray gets back to Zach, she starts applying the medicine, but her intense focus on doing the best that she can disturbs Zach, who asks why she does this to save him, to which Rachel responds that it's the least she could do for her god. This disturbs him, but so have a lot of other things in this place, so he lets it be. After they're done, the two make their way to the elevator and head to B1. The second she sees this floor, Ray starts freaking out, telling Zach not to proceed any further. The episode ends here. So, that was a lot more to talk about compared to the previous episodes. I apologize for the inconsistent pacing, but there's just a lot more plot-relevant stuff to discuss here. Whereas the last chapter explored Zach's psychology, here, Rachel is the star of the show. We get a lot more detail into her religious beliefs, which have only lightly been touched upon prior. I thought it was fascinating that when Gray brings up the idea that God may not grant her wish to die by Zach's hands, Rachel comes to the conclusion that she must accept Zach as her God, since he's the only person who she knows wants to fulfill that desire. Here's something I find rather funny. During this chapter, Gray repeatedly chastises Ray for her self-centeredness, and blames many of the unfortunate things that befall her on her own actions. I find most of his criticisms to fall flat. The deaths of Eddie and Kathy were in self-defense, asking Zach to kill her was a mutual agreement, and Danny's obsessive behavior is his own fault. However, he never notices the one truly selfish thing Rachel has done during her time here, forcing Zach to become her god without considering his input. Well, that in the hands. That was pretty bad too, I guess. And Gray works pretty well as this episode's main antagonist. B2 is obtuse and hard to comprehend, much like its master. I especially like the twist at the end where Ray decides to let her enemy live for once, since Zach's nowhere to be found and the idea of killing someone doesn't make her as happy. This is never stated explicitly, but I have a theory that no one ever made it to B2 prior to Ray and Zach. If you think about it practically, how would anyone be able to make it out alive once they got to the final part of B3? My answer? They probably didn't. Ray and Zach only escaped because of their shenanigans causing Kathy to enter the floor, leaving her wide open for them to kill. This is obviously not something that could happen with just one person, and the words of both Kathy in the previous episode and Gray in the following one indicates that two sacrifices traveling together has happened either very rarely or not at all. Just something that I thought was interesting. One more left.
The Lord God is righteous. He detests liars, as well as those whose hands are unclean.
Dismissing Rachel's pleas to not move forward, Zach enters the room to find two corpses stitched together. Upon seeing it, Rachel begs Zach to kill her on the spot, which Zach refuses to do since she hasn't completed her end of the deal. She turns into a mess of emotions, declaring that God hates liars and that Zach, her god, needs to kill her now before he knows too much. She passes out afterwards. After Zach makes sure that she's okay, Danny tricks him into exiting the room and traps him outside. He declares that this floor is the very essence of Ray, and if Zach wants to see her again, he'll have to learn her full story. This turns out to be a bit harder than you'd think, since the entire house is booby-trapped, and one wrong move could result in Zach's brutal end. Eventually, he stumbles into Gray, who is here because he's developed a bit of an interest in Zach and Ray's relationship. The Reverend explains that, from a very young age, he observed the behaviors of the ultra-religious. While some were noble and virtuous, the others deeply sickened him, using God as a tool to condemn anyone they disagreed with. He eventually began to wonder what God truly thought of these people, so he constructed this complex to observe people's actions as the god of this domain. Any people placed on B7 were test subjects, directly monitored by Gray, dubbed sacrifices. The floor masters were dubbed angels, whose task it was to test the sacrifices by hunting them down in their assigned locations. This is kind of a weird time to explain this, especially considering that he's talking to a former employee of sorts. This doesn't help Zach much with his predicament, nor does he seem to care much about Gray's words anyway. I understand that the audience needed to know the context behind the construction of such a brutal facility, especially with what Zach is about to find out. But was this really the best time to insert this information? I would have preferred bits of info be gradually given to the player for them to put together by the end. Before Zach departs, Gray encourages him to check out the bedrooms in the hallway using some of the tools he's found around B1. Curiously, one of the bedrooms is labeled Rachel Gardner. Inside is a TV, which pretty much spills the beans on everything regarding Rachel's past. The video is a recording of a conversation Ray had with Danny in the immediate aftermath of the murder incident. She tells about how she was raised in an abusive home. Both of her parents constantly berated each other and Ray, but her father was especially bad, as he drank heavily and regularly beat everyone in the household. One day, Rachel was listening to the usual fighting from her room, when suddenly, there's a scream from her mother followed by silence. When she checks on them in the kitchen, she catches her father mutilating his wife's corpse. Rachel runs away from him before he can do the same thing to her, but he eventually corners her in her room. Unfortunately for him, Rachel took a loaded gun that was stashed away by her mother a few days prior. I don't think I need to tell you what she does next. After the deaths of her parents, Ray stitched them together to create, as she puts it, a perfect family. Gross. She lived with her parents' corpses until police took them away, and she was brought to Danny for cognitive evaluation. Before Zach can see any more, he smashes the television to bits, sickened by what he witnessed. He runs back to the living room and finds the doors now open, and Rachel is awakened. Before he can confront her about this new information, Danny appears to fill in the remainder of Ray's story. After hearing her confession, Danny insisted that Gray make her an angel along with the others. She served as B1's floor master for a while, but when she stumbled upon a Bible, she became invalid for the experiment, as the angels had to be unfamiliar with religious material. Thus, she became a sacrifice. Ray needed Zach to kill her because God would not allow her to kill herself, and she never revealed these details because she needed God to not know that she had killed other human beings. However, even though Ray now views Zach as God, she was still worried about her past coming up because of Zach's distaste for liars. Danny tells Zach to run out of the building so he can have Ray to himself. With her full story now revealed, Ray asks Zach if he'll still be her god. Zach, who was already not enthralled with the idea, says
no.
After hearing this, Rachel loses her shit. If Zach can't be her god, then he'll be nothing. It's here where, after all this time, her theme finally comes out. And yeah, it's the best one in the game. Unlike the other floor masters, who prefer direct confrontation, Rachel fights by activating traps and running away. As Zach is about to corner her in the living room, Danny appears yet again, gun in hand. Since Rachel's now interested in killing Zach, Danny's decided that letting Zach escape is no longer an option for him. He hands Rachel his gun, but she surprisingly shoots Danny instead. This time, he doesn't have any insurance. While she appreciates what the doctor has done for her, giving her a home and all, she knows deep down that a life living with Danny would make her unhappy. She raises her gun again to shoot Zach, but he calls her bluff. He correctly guesses that deep down, Ray still wants him to kill her. She argues that doing so is meaningless because she's been defiled as a killer herself. But Zach argues back that it doesn't matter. He's the one who said he'd kill her, and he's gonna do it, her past be damned. This finally snaps Ray out of her breakdown, and she comes back to her original senses, re-promising to their initial deal. She always thought that she needed to make a promise with God to assure her death. But looking at everything Zach has done for her up to this point, it doesn't make much sense for her to not have faith that he'll carry out the task, even if he's human. It's a great scene. I really can't do it justice just talking about it. The music that plays fits it so well. It's tragic, representing the death of Ray's worldview, but also empowering, now that Ray can make decisions of her own free will. The two then discuss how they're going to get out of the building, and Rachel intuits that the building's exit was actually on B2 this whole time.
Wow!
Oops. Could have avoided quite a bit if they figured that out earlier. In B2, Zach breaks the stained glass windows of the cathedral, revealing a large staircase to the outside. As they slowly make their way up, the building's self-destruct sequence activates. Fires and debris surround the duo, and Zach is in a state of panic. He has PTSD from being burned as a kid. That's why he wears bandages. I didn't mention it earlier because it wasn't very important until now. Rachel is able to bring him back to his senses, however, and the two of them smash their way through the rubble. Zach's scythe breaks as soon as he gets to the end, but fortunately, they're almost out the door, so that doesn't really matter. It mattered. Right when they're at the end, Danny, crawling on the floor with his semi-functioning body, shoots Rachel in the back. He wasn't able to have what he wanted, so he's decided that they don't get their happy ending either. Rachel is barely hanging on to her life, but Danny tries to finish her off anyway, only for Gray to come in and shoot him with a crossbow. Gray tells Zach that the only way he can save Rachel is by taking her outside immediately, which Zach promptly does. The building is then consumed by the flames. Gray's horrific experiment has finally run its course. The second Zach reaches the outside, police sirens can already be heard from the distance. This is what Gray meant by saving Rachel. She's taken into police custody for a second time. and Zack is arrested and charged for Ray's kidnapping and the murder of her parents. A charred body is found in the burnt remains of the building, but it's disfigured to the point where no one can identify it. Authorities come to believe that a cult was involved in the burning of the building, though no further details are given. Rachel Gardner is placed in a rehabilitation facility. Isaac Foster is sentenced to death. Much time passes after the burning of the building, possibly months, and Ray is still in rehab. She's doing okay, but she still longs for Zack to end her life. One night, as she gets ready for bed, she hears a knocking on her window. It's Zack. He's broken out of prison, and he's ready to fulfill his end of the deal. Before authorities can arrive, he whisks Rachel away. Quite an ending, huh? A part of me was hoping that at some point in the story, Ray would grow out of her desire for death. This is something that Gray confronts her about before she heads back to B2, but she simply responds that she feels what she's done is still unforgivable. Which... look, I understand that killing your father is a hard thing to do. I wouldn't expect anyone to come out of that with no emotional scars. But it was so obviously self-defense, and it's unfortunate that she never comes to recognize that her actions were justified. This is the second time this game has painted self-defense in a negative light, which is why I believe that Ray killing the ghosts on B3 was supposed to be viewed by the audience as a bad thing. Maybe it's my own moral compass getting in the way of enjoying this story to the maximum, but I've always believed that suicide should never be the solution for psychological anguish. Regardless of my personal hang-ups, Angels of Death has, without a shadow of a doubt, one of the more interesting stories to grace any RPG Maker game. It had some issues, no doubt, but it kept my attention the whole way through, and that deserves praise. All the characters are entertaining, the setting is interesting, and the dialogue is great. If there's any overarching theme to Angels of Death, it would be to not deify people. Gray's experiment does nothing other than result in the deaths of people at the hands of the floor masters. As a god, he was fucking horrible. Gray also views his angels, Rachel excluded, as being on a higher level than normal people. Whenever they do some truly despicable shit that even he can't justify, he simply blames their actions on other people because his angels can't possibly have done this without some outside influence. In a conversation with Danny as the complex burns to the ground, Gray admits that he was wrong to give this power to people. His angels weren't glorious human beings who deserved the authority to give justice to others. They were only human. So, to go back to that question I asked at the very beginning of this video, why is this game not as well known as the TV show? Honestly, I doubt it's because of any of the game's content. I think it's because RPG Maker games just aren't that popular in general. Kind of a boring answer, but it's the truth. This is a fairly niche type of game. In 2020, a bonus episode titled Episode Eddie was published onto the Steam store. It gave players a look into Eddie's backstory. While I know some of you would be interested in my thoughts on this, I'm not going to talk about it in this video beyond saying that if you liked Angels of Death, then you'll enjoy Eddie's adventure as well. Since 2015, Vaka Game Magazine has gone on to publish other, better games, including another written by Makoto Sanada. If you're looking to get into Vaka games specifically, then I would recommend either Noel the Mortal Fate or The Forest of Drizzling Rain before Angels of Death. However, if you're partial to RPG Maker horror, then I definitely recommend checking it out. With an interesting story and a competent everything else, Angels of Death more than justifies its price.